Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, is the Senate in a quorum call?
It is not. Senator's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I know that you and all of our colleagues and those watching today know that we've been focused on the budget resolution, a very important document for the country, for the Senate, for the Congress. A lot of big issues that we're all focused on. But one of which I wanted to talk about this morning, Mr. President, that relates to the budget document, and actually, to be perfectly frank, relates to a number of the speeches my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been coming down to the floor and talking about, relates to energy, really important for America, the environment, also very important for America, and a little bit to my surprise, all these experts coming down on the floor, Alaska, my state. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that, some of what my colleagues have been talking about. My state, there seems to be a few experts on Alaska from states like Massachusetts, Oregon. I just want to maybe put things in perspective from the senator who's actually from the state, not these other senators who, to be honest, don't know much about what they're talking about. But the one thing that you're seeing, Mr. President, is that it's for sure, there's kind of a issue in the debate here on the floor when you see talking points that are just stale. Talking points that if you took a speech from 30, 40 years ago, same talking points. Stale talking points from the other side of the aisle, been used for decades, that haven't been updated or reflect what's really been happening in the country in terms of technological advances, environmental standards, and one of the most important things that's happened in America over the last decade, and that is the American energy renaissance. The American energy renaissance. Now, look, I know some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they don't even like to talk about it. They don't like to acknowledge it. Energy, ooh, we don't produce that in America. Oh, yes, we do. Oh, yes, we do. And we're doing it really, really well. And it's benefiting millions and millions and millions of Americans in every state in the country. Now, Mr. President, the budget resolution that we're debating has a provision in it, real simple. I bet if you polled it with every American, Democrat, Republican, people watching on TV, probably 90% approval. Simple instruction in the budget resolution that says the Congress needs to look at ways to increase federal revenues by increasing American energy production. What could be wrong with that? Increasing American energy production. So that provision that we're actually debating right now should be very bipartisan. Who's against that? Who could be against that? And why is this so important? Why is the American energy renaissance so important? Well, Mr. President, as you know, because your state's certainly involved in it, the energy renaissance that's happening in the United States right now is a win, 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 win on almost every category you can imagine. What do I mean by the energy renaissance? Well, right now in our great nation, with our resources, we're producing more oil, more natural gas, more renewables than any other place in the world. That's really good for the country. That's really good for the country. That's the renaissance. That's really a revolution in energy production. And it is something that you would think on the Senate floor should be completely bipartisan. Fortunately, it isn't. But let me talk a little bit about how this energy renaissance and what's in the budget resolution to produce more energy for America, by Americans, is good for the country. Let's count the ways. When I said win, 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 I wasn't joking. The wins are all on the board. First, energy security. For our nation, lower cost energy. With the increase in natural gas. We're seeing the drop in prices of gas, natural gas, for homes, manufacturers, increasing manufacturing, enormously important for our nation. Economic growth and jobs. In this sector, the energy sector, these are good jobs. The presiding officer has a lot of these jobs in his state. I have a lot of these jobs in my state. These are really important jobs. And when you look at the weak economic growth over the United States over the last 10 years, the one sector that's actually driving growth has been in the energy sector. How about the trade deficit? How about the trade deficit? Big problem. Everybody talks about it. The president's very focused on it. We are now starting to export oil, export natural gas. My state's been exporting natural gas for over 4 decades. That helps our trade deficit. And then when you look at the federal budget deficit, okay, energy is a huge impact positively on the federal budget deficit. And that's what the budget resolution asks the Congress to do in terms of policy. Hey, let's produce more energy so we can produce more revenue for the federal government. That's a good idea. Nobody should be opposed to that. And then, Mr. President, as you know, when we're the world's energy superpower again, as we are, that really helps our national security, really helps our foreign policy. You know, a lot of Americans have been concerned for decades that we have troops in the Middle East, that we have troops in areas where energy is really important. Well, let's produce it here. You know, I was in a meeting last year at the Munich Security Conference with the great senator from Arizona and many of my colleagues, bipartisan, by the way. And Senator McCain led that, Kodal, to the Munich Security Conference in Germany. We met with a very prominent Russian dissident who'd been fighting and battling against Vladimir Putin. And at the very end of the meeting, we asked a simple question: what more can we do in the United States to help somebody like you, who's battling against really a dictator, who doesn't have our interests at heart? And you know what this very smart Russian official said? Courageous man. He said, America needs to produce more energy. That's how you take down the leadership in the Kremlin. More energy. This is national security. And let me say one more thing, Mr. President. It doesn't get talked about a lot. It's not just helpful in all these areas. When the United States of America is producing energy, it helps the global environment. Now, some people say, well, wait a minute. A lot of the colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they come down on the floor and they kind of insinuate that when our country produces energy, it actually hurts the environment. That's not the case. When the United States produces energy, it actually helps the global environment. Now, why is that the case? Why is that the case? Well, let me just pause for a minute because, like I said, a lot of my colleagues have been coming down on the floor talking about Alaska, energy, the environment. Again, not with a lot of knowledge. Stale talking points, yes. They've been using for 40 years. Literally, I think one of my colleagues over here has been in the Congress plus or minus 40 years and using the same talking points on this. As someone who came to the Senate previously as a job of Attorney General and the Commissioner of Natural Resources and Energy in Alaska, I know a little bit about this topic. And I can tell you, Mr. President, 2 important points. When my colleagues talk a little bit about Alaska and the environment and energy, first, Senator Murkowski and I, we care a lot more about the environment, the wildlife, the pristine wilderness in our great, amazing state than any other member of this body. So I don't need senators coming down from places like Massachusetts, Oregon, Washington, Vermont, Rhode Island, and talking about Alaska's environment. Okay? Thanks. don't need it. I care way more than any of you, and with all due respect, know a heck of a lot more about it than any of you. And I also know this. In my state, and I believe most of the country, but particularly in Alaska, Democrats, Republicans, Alaska natives, non-natives, we certainly support the highest standards on the environment, but we also support responsible resource development. And here's the key issue, Mr. President. We know that we can do both. You can protect the pristine, amazing Alaska environment, and you can responsibly develop our resources. So let's talk about how we do this. Let's talk about how this applies to Alaska, but how this applies to the rest of the country in general. As I mentioned, this is a really important point. We have the highest standards on developing our resources, our energy, anywhere in the world. And we have some of the most technologically advanced and sustainable ways to develop resources in the energy sector. And that allows us to do what I just mentioned, protect the environment and develop our resources. So here's a really important point that a lot of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle miss. They come down here and they talk about, and by the way, they were in alliance with the last administration, how do we shut down energy development? How do we make it harder? How do we delay it? As I mentioned, Mr. President, I was Attorney General and the DNR Commissioner in Alaska from almost 6 years of the Obama administration. It was all about how to shut it down in Alaska, how to delay it in Alaska, and how to shut it down in America. This is not what the country wants. This is not what the country needs. And certainly, one issue that's often overlooked. This doesn't help the global environment, as they claim. Doesn't. Why is that? Because when you chase away investment in places like Alaska with the highest standards on the environment in the world, what does that do? That drives capital, that drives investment to places like Russia and Iran and Brazil, whose standards are so much lower than ours. Russians on the tundra, in the Arctic, they don't care anything about their environment. In my state and in the rest of America, we do. You know, I don't need to remind people, but Russia and Iran right now are certainly our adversaries. And yet, the policies that some of my colleagues like to promote, and certainly the last administration promoted, are to drive away investment, drive away energy production in America with the highest standards in the world, so the Russians and the Iranians can take the capital and produce energy. They don't have high standards on the environment, and they're our adversaries. It makes no sense. No sense. So how do we do this in Alaska? What are the environmental standards that almost no other place in the world, maybe Norway, maybe to some degree Canada, uses? What is the technology that enables us to produce American energy with American jobs for the American people with the highest standards in the world? Let me provide a few examples, Mr. President. But first, what I want everybody here to be aware of, don't believe these doomsday scenarios. Don't believe the misinformed commentary. When my Democratic colleagues come down to the floor with very little knowledge about what is really happening in this sector, don't believe it. When they come down and talk about a state like mine, Alaska, about which they know next to nothing, don't believe it. Let me just give you one infamous example. In the 70s, we were debating in the Senate, and I think one of my colleagues was maybe here then, probably using the same talking points, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, one of the greatest energy infrastructure projects in the history of the world. 800 miles, 16 billion barrels of oil, and 1.2 million barrels a day from Americans in America. Well, the people who were against it came down and said, oh no, the Central Arctic caribou herd is going to be decimated. These beautiful animals that we care so much about in Alaska. If you do this, those were the arguments right here on this floor. So what happened to the Central Arctic caribou herd? Again, we care about these animals way more than anybody else does in this body. So in 1975, about 5,000 caribou. Today, 66,000. I don't think the herd was decimated. You haven't heard that from anybody because they don't know. But this is the kind of thing. You hear the doomsday scenarios from people with no knowledge, and then when it doesn't happen, they never come down to the Senate floor and go, oh, by the way, we were wrong about that. So let me talk just briefly about some of what we do to make sure we do this in the most responsible way in the world. First, in the energy business, one thing you do is you explore, okay? So in Alaska, again, highest standards in the world. A lot of other places in the United States have these standards. But in the Arctic, we have what's called no impact exploration. Okay, what does that mean? It means we literally do everything to make sure there is no impact on these great species, like the polar bear, which, again, we care a lot more about our animals than my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. So what does that mean, no impact exploration? Well, we undertake exploration required by state standards. These aren't federal standards, where we essentially have what's called ice roads and ice pads. So let me show you what that means. So we only allow for exploration in the winter on the tundra, and then when an exploration crew comes out, they have to build an ice road. It's a road made of ice over the tundra, and this is an example of an ice road. And then they do exploration on an ice pad. So they have drills, and they do all this work on the ice, on the tundra. They have about 4 months to do it, okay? And then they're done, and then they leave. And so what does the tundra look like after that exploration on ice? Right here. That's just one capped well, an exploration well. It's as if nobody was even there. Literally zero impact. These are Alaska standards, highest in the world. They're expensive, yes, but we do it because we care so much about the environment. That's the exploration phase. How about the production phase? What's happened in the production phase? The innovations in technology, many of which have occurred in my state, have made it so the surface footprint, when you actually put together a production pad, has shrunk dramatically. You look at here, this is Prudhoe Bay in the 70s. The other developments in Alaska, Kuparik, Alpine, Liberty. What happens is the surface footprint has shrunk dramatically. 11, 12 acres now. And yet, the ability to horizontally drill extends the reach of these wells underneath the ground, where you can reach resources in an incredibly vast manner without impacting the environment at all. So the example I gave, if there was a rig set right here on the Capitol building, in terms of horizontal drilling, it could extend out to Andrews Air Force Base in southeast, Silver Spring, Maryland to the north, and well into Fairfax County. Miles and miles and miles. And yet, the surface footprint, the impact on the environment is minimal. So that's what we do. That's what we do. Now, you don't hear about it from the other side of the aisle, but it's really important as we debate these issues that all Americans know this, because more energy for the country is really positive. So, Mr. President, in conclusion, tonight the budget resolution is not just going to be a vehicle for tax reform, but there's also, as I mentioned, going to be an instruction to increase revenues for the country through more American energy production. Simple. It's a simple instruction. As I mentioned, this should be very non-controversial. What could be wrong with more energy production, particularly in a state like mine, where the standards are the highest in the world and the technology is the most advanced in the world? What could be controversial about more energy production? More energy production means more American jobs, more American economic growth, more American national security, more American energy security, and decreased federal budgets and trade deficits, and a more sustainable global environment, because no one in the world produces energy more responsibly than Americans, especially Alaskans. Nevertheless, some of my Democratic colleagues will be putting forth an amendment that does just the opposite. Think about that. An amendment that says, let's kill energy production, thereby undermining American job growth, good jobs, American economic growth, American national security and energy security, while increasing our budget and trade deficits and harming the global environment. That's a lose, lose, lose scenario to me, Mr. President. But that's what's at stake tonight. And later this afternoon, when we debate that amendment, and I certainly would ask all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to reject any attempts to not take advantage of this incredible opportunity in America, the American energy renaissance, that we need to continue. And this afternoon, we're going to have an opportunity to do that. Thank you. I yield the floor.